Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live session. My name is Annette Gel, and I'm Quality Operation and Training Manager at Pharma Limited. I have been working in the pharmaceutical industry for over 25 years, and my experience ranges from manufacturing to laboratories, quality assurance, and training. Today, I would like to build on two themes that I have discussed in my recent webinars. And the first one is the GMP project management session, where I talked about the pharmaceutical project and the fact that they are not just engineering project with compliance added at the end, but that they are projects where compliance has to be engineered in from the beginning. And then I had the second session, which was on supplier management, that I ran a few weeks back. And we looked at the supplier qualification and oversight, the scorecard, the quality agreements, and the escalation process, all part of pharmaceutical quality system. Today's topic really sits between those two areas, the vendor and equipment lead times. On the surface, this topic seemed like a procurement topic, but in practice, a late equipment package can move the design qualification, the site acceptance testing, your IQ, OQs, and PQs down the timeline. So the question for today's webinar is, how do we make the lead time risks visible earlier? And how do we manage it without weakening the GMP? As we go through, think about that one project you were involved in or you are involved now, where a vendor date has moved. And the question would be, was it really just a delivery issue? Or did the impact of that movement of the vendor date spread further than you expected? If you have any questions during today's webinar or any comments, please put them in the comment section and I will respond to you after the webinar is finished. Okay, I think everyone's connected now, so we can start. Let's start with the question, why are the lead times the silent killers of our schedules? A late equipment package rarely stops at the shipping delay. What it does, it cascades through the entire qualification chain, turning a procurement issue into a multiplier of downstream schedule risks. And the important word here is the cascade. In pharma, a late equipment package rarely stops at the shipping point. It starts with the purchase order or the vendor slot, but then it will affect the drawings, the supplier documents, the shipment, the commissioning, your IQ, OQ, PQs, and sometimes it will affect the regulatory readiness. This point clearly connects to a project management webinar where we talked about validation being parallel work stream, not just a closing activity. The hidden problem with long lead time for equipment is that it can quietly remove the time available for the validation work. The building may still be moving forward. The project plan may still look busy, and the teams may feel that the progress is being made. But if the equipment evidence is not arriving, the regulated critical path is already under pressure. And then you can see here the timelines can turn from days to months, and the pressure of the launch date is mounting up. So when someone says the delivery is only a few weeks late, the better question here is, which downstream activities are now compressed. And at risk, is factory acceptance testing still a meaningful task? Will site acceptance testing support still be available with the time delays? Are protocols going to be approved in time? Are the utilities going to be ready? Is quality assurance going to be able to disposition the evidence? So as you can see, the delivery date is only one part of the real delay. Important part to remember in all this is that the schedule pressure will never relax the GMP obligations. This is the tension that makes this topic very important. The project wants to recover the date. That is understandable. Commercially, many pharma projects are driven by the first to market point. But operationally, capacity may be urgently needed. However, the GMP obligations do not reduce because the equipment has arrived late. Any shortcuts that may be done will become visible and will cost more in time and financially later down the line. In the project management webinar, I said that every design has to be auditable and that the change control becomes central once the design basis is set. And what you see here is the practical version of that principle. If we compress a sequence, change a vendor, move FAT scope to SAT, or we accept a different configuration, change a barrier concept, or change how evidence is going to be used. This is not just project flexibility. So all of this needs to be assessed and formally documented. And this links us to that supplier management webinar, because supplier is not simply delivering metal or software. They are supplying part of the evidence that will allow the site to operate under GMP, and that is a very important fact. That means responsibilities, documentation, communication routes, and escalation expectations all have to be clear before the pressure arrives. Based on that, I would like to share with you 7 common root causes of the long lead times. It is important to diagnose the reason for delay rather than just assume what the reason for the delay is, because it is tempting to say the supplier is late, but often it isn't as simple as that, because the supplier may be late because the URS kept changing, or because the drawings were reviewed slowly, or they had to be redone, because responsibilities between the supplier and the site team were unclear, or because no one escalated the warning signs early enough. In the supplier management webinar, I provided information that was very useful because it reminded us that the supplier oversight is not a one-time approval exercise. It is, and it must be, ongoing monitoring. We should be using supplier scorecards, KPI reviews, audit outcomes, complaint and deviation trends, and the review meetings where we can review this and spot any weak signals. So the big root causes from here to remember really are the ones that can be challenged early, which is unstable requirements, heavy documentation. You can have global friction like component shortages or freight issues. There could be supply capacity issues, outsourced activity governance. When it comes to sterile manufacturing, you have the complexity of the contamination control strategy and the barrier design. And then you've got the slow escalation of issues and the weak indicators that allow quietly the schedule to slip. So these are your big ones to keep an eye out for. The earlier we name the issue and the cause of the issue, the more realistic the recovery plan will become. So let's explore now the downstream impact of the delay. The information here is especially relevant to brownfield or the operating facilities. Delayed equipment can be painful in any project, but it becomes more difficult when the site is operational, because you may need to plan a shutdown window. You may need to build a finished goods inventory, or you may have to have a temporary warehouse capacity. You may need to have a specialist vendor personnel to travel to the site to do the SAT. And if one of those elements the timeline moves, you may end up with several teams that can be waiting at the same time. This nicely connects us with the previous GMP project management webinar, where I've talked about the dual handover. And that is the handover that you do to operations at the same time as you do the handover to the regulator. A project is not truly finished just because installation is complete. Operations need they need a usable equipment, they need approved procedures, they need people that are trained in those new procedures and the usage of that equipment. And it needs to be in a controlled, qualified state. And the regulators, on the other hand, they need to see that the decisions and evidence all make sense. So the takeaway here is that delayed equipment doesn't just delay a physical installation, because it can create a chain reaction across your shutdown planning, your staffing requirements, your documentation processes, your qualification, and even your inspection readiness. So now we can have a look at some supplier published numbers for the benchmark, but we must not treat them as universal rules, because public benchmark data are useful, but they are only they're not a substitute for what you have confirmed from your supplier. So you can't go by what the benchmark data tells you. You need to go by what your supplier confirms to you. Some suppliers publish lead times for standardized platforms, but many equipment categories, of course, depend heavily on the actual configuration, the factory capacity, the scope, the automation, the shipping, and the overall site readiness. And this is a good place to link this back to supplier management. A few weeks back, I've discussed the risk-based supplier qualification and the need to verify the suitability and not to just accept the supplier's claim at the face value. And the same logic really applies here. A published lead time is a planning indicator. The project still needs to ask what configuration is assumed for that published lead time, and what documentation is included in that package, and what is the FAT model, okay, and what can change the date, which part can influence the delivery date of the package. The useful message for the project team is that standardization and modularization can reduce lead time risk, but it will only do it if your URS is stable enough and to choose the standard route early enough in your project. So here I would like to share with you a practical model of a mitigation book. The most important point is that the strongest mitigation starts before the purchase order is placed. I know you might be telling yourself, yes, in ideal world, we would have enough time, but in reality, we never have enough time. So sometimes we just have to act and we have to book it early. The message, however, needs to be clear and it needs to go upstream, because once the PO is placed, of course, you can still expedite and govern it, but many of the strategic options have already been narrowed down, and it will be difficult to allow for a lot of movement there. So it's very important. So when it comes to the 5 layers of the mitigation playbook here, is that the first layer, the layer 1, is the front end planning. So what you need to do as your first step, you need to identify the long lead items at the concept, okay? Freeze the critical URS parameters and align procurement milestones to your FAT, to your SAT, IQ, OQ, and PQ windows. Then you have layer 2 mitigation point, which is supplier selection and onboarding. And what we need to do here is assess the GMP competence of that supplier, the documentation capabilities, their capacity, and their change discipline. If you attended the supplier webinar, this should sound familiar, because we've discussed the supplier qualification, the quality agreements, the responsibilities, and the ongoing monitoring. Layer 3 is all about active expediting. And this is not chasing everyone by email once a month. This is about having a defined frequency of review, having action owners, one action, one owner, recovery plans, and where appropriate, even shop visits or third-party inspection. Layer 4 is all about parallelization. So we want to select the standard platforms, modular fabrication if we can, factory testing, and early documentation review. And the last layer, the layer 5, is about contract and your logistics discipline. This is where you need to make sure that there are clear responsibilities assigned. So you have a proper review of your SLAs. You do have your escalation triggers set, so you know what your escalation triggers are. You need to have freight plans and preservation requirements clearly set out. Now, I have 2 examples that I would like to share with you, and they kind of help us avoid 2 extremes in the schedule recovery. The first extreme is thinking that there is nothing we can do once a vendor date moves. And the second extreme of thinking is that the schedule recovery will remove GMP work, because neither of those 2 is true. So the modular execution example shows us how work can be moved off the site critical path. So you can have off-site fabrication, you can have factory acceptance testing and qualification package preparation. That can happen while the site work continues. And this is powerful, but it does not remove the need for interface control, for SAT, for the commissioning, qualification, and the quality approval. And this links us back to the project management, where we talked about parallel work streams. Of course, parallel work streams, they work well, but they need stronger coordination and not weaker discipline for them to be efficient. The isolator relocation and retrofit example is also useful here because it shows that an alternative asset strategies can save you time and cost. What it also reinforces is the supplier management message. An alternative supplier route or legacy asset needs proper assessment, documentation, recommissioning, and requalification. So the important point to remember here is that the retrofit is not a shortcut around your IQ/OQ. It is a recovery route that still sits and well inside your GMP control. Let's move to KPIs, or key performance indicators. And what I'm trying to show you here is about moving from reporting history to managing risk. So going from lagging indicators to leading indicators. Vendor on-time delivery is a useful metric, but it's often too late. If the first red signal is the equipment has not arrived, the dashboard is telling us what has already happened, not giving us time to intervene at all. In the project management webinar, I talked about managing risks and making them visible earlier and building the discipline into a project. In the supplier management webinar, I talked about the supplier scorecard, the KPIs, supplier reviews, and the performance monitoring. And the information here on this slide brings those ideas nicely together. So let's look at the leading indicators, which are very important. So the long lead indication index, which you could have as a leading indicator, will measure whether we've identified all schedule critical equipment packages before the concept or before the freeze of the design. And your target should be at least 95%. If your important equipment is only recognized as a long lead later in a detailed design, the project may already have missed the opportunity to reserve a manufacturing slot. Then we have the timely purchase order release rate, which will tell us whether the long lead orders are actually being placed by the planned date. A project may have correctly identified the critical isolator or the filling line, but it does not protect the schedule if the PO is delayed by the approval or incomplete requirements or by prolonged commercial negotiations. What you should have there is about 90% rate that if you go below that, it should trigger attention. Then we have vendor document review cycle time. This is often one of the earliest and most useful warning signals. The equipment may not yet appear late, but the supplier drawings, your FAT protocols, your automation documents may be sitting in review longer than expected. For example, if the agreed review time is 10 working days, but the responses are regularly taken 20 days, the delivery date is already being eroded through the repeated review cycles. So it's important to catch it early and have it in your leading indicators. The final leading indicator that I would like to talk about is the recovery plan coverage. So every amber or red package should have a documented recovery plan accountable owners, and agreed days. What do you do if you have a slippage? How do you recover? An amber status without a recovery plan is simply acknowledging that you have a problem and not controlling the risk and not doing anything with it. On the right hand side, we have the lagging indicators, and they are generally easier to set. I will not spend as much time on them as the leading ones, which are, for me, more important. You have vendor on-time delivery. That tells us whether the equipment arrived by the approved need date. You have the SAT start variance that you can use, which measures how far site acceptance testing has moved from the baseline. And here, a delay of more than 10 working days may affect the vendor engineering availability, your commissioning resources, the clean room access, and the overall start of the qualification. Then you have the IQOQ and PQ completion variance, which is directly linked to your GMP ready date. And then you have the 4 boxes at the bottom that show you that these indicators can be brought together into a practical one-page dashboard that you can use. So you can have a portfolio status that gives you the overall traffic light position of all the critical packages. You can have a green, amber, and red, so your traffic light signals. Then you can have a critical or high risk review, which will focus your leadership attention on the few packages that are most likely to affect the critical path. Qualification readiness will show whether the protocols and vendor document and utilities and site conditions and QA approvals are all ready and will be ready when the equipment arrives. And then you have the execution decision needed box, which will clearly identify the matters that the project team cannot resolve alone, such as additional funding, contractual escalation, a change of supplier, or an acceptance of an alternative technical solution. And what is the core message here is that the leading indicators tell us when to act. Lagging indicators tell us what has already happened. And a strong dashboard should help the team intervene before the delivery date fails, not simply explain the delivery afterwards. So let's shift from KPIs now to a governance, and governance which includes the escalation process and change control. Escalation here should not be seen as blame. Okay, escalation is the route to decision before the options that we have disappear. From the project management webinar, you'll remember that change control is not administration at the end of the project, but it is the backbone that keeps the scope, the evidence, the risks and approvals all connected. From the supplier management webinar, you will remember that the supplier-related issues such as delays, non-conformances, uncommunicated changes, or weak CAPA responses need a defined escalation route. And those definitions and those things are documented in your quality agreement. And you can apply the same thinking to your lead times. If a PO is not placed by the target date, if the drawing review is beyond SLA, if the FAT has a critical failure, okay, if delivery slips by more than 10 working days, or if the package threatens your GMP ready state, you should have escalation patterns and change control, how you're going to manage that. And that needs evidence, a recovery proposal. Of course, it needs an owner who's going to own that recovery, that new action, and where relevant, it will need a formal change impact assessment. So don't hide the scheduler recovery inside informal technical decisions, because it will catch up with you. Right, so now we can round it up and move from the concept to action. I said it at the beginning of this webinar, and I'm going to say it again, that the late equipment is rarely just a supplier problem. It is a cross-functional quality, schedule, and a regulatory readiness problem. It shows up first in your planning, discipline, then supplier governance, and the speed of escalation. Late equipment is rarely the supplier problem because it affects the project delivery, the qualification, the operational readiness, and ultimately your regulatory readiness. And the first signs usually appear much earlier, and they appear in weak planning, in the unclear requirements, in the poor supplier governance, and the slow escalation. So what I would like to be the main takeaways from today's webinar are: the first takeaway is treat the lead time risk as a life cycle quality issue and not a purchasing issue. As we discussed in the project manager webinar a few weeks ago, validation and qualification are part of the project from the beginning. They are not activities that can be simply added at the end. The second takeaway is to freeze the critical URS parameters early enough to support your supplier selection and your PO release. This doesn't mean that every minor detail must be finalized at that point, but the supplier must have enough clarity to design and manufacture the equipment without repeated changes. The third takeaway I would like you to take away with you is that the supplier selection should be risk-based, and it should consider more than the price and technical capability. We also need to assess what's their documentation quality, what's the GMP experience of the supplier, what's their capacity, and what is their change control discipline. How do they manage change? Because that we will have to live once we go with that supplier. These expectations should then be clearly defined in your technical agreement and the contract. And the fourth takeaway here is governance. Strong projects use leading indicators. They have clear escalation triggers and timely decisions. Problems should be escalated with recovery options that still exist, not when the equipment is already laid and the qualification dates have been missed. So before your next project review, I would really encourage you to make one practical commitment in each of those areas. So for planning, identify one long lead package earlier. For the supplier governance, strengthen your contractual and documentation or your review commitment. And for the monitoring, add a leading indicator to your project dashboard. Small improvements in these areas will prevent larger delays later. And the aim is not to remove every risk, but is to make the risk visible early enough so your project team or you can act on it when there are more options available. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining today's session. I hope the main takeaway is practical here, that you keep lead time risk on the agenda before it becomes a crisis. Do not wait until the supplier says the equipment is laid. Look earlier at URS stability, document reviews, cycles, and supplier capacities. And have recovery plans and escalation triggers. If this topic is relevant to your current work, it's worth looking again at the two connected areas that I've covered previously, which is GMP project management, because it will help you understand the regulated project critical path, and then of course supplier management, because that helps us control outsourced activities and supplier performance across the life cycle. If you would like to know more about specific training in those areas or any other areas, please connect with the Academy of Pharmaceutical Excellence for more training on facility project delivery, GMP compliance and quality operations. Join us or connect through the links on the last slide, or contact me directly on LinkedIn or at anetagel@pqs.ltd. Thank you again, and I look forward to the continuing discussion. Thank you, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.